Hello and welcome to Raider HQ After Dark. I'm your host Raider, and in this video I'm going to be discussing how the elbow is rated. Now I'm going to preface this by saying that there are a lot of different ways that the elbow can be rated, and I'm going to say that it's one of the most um, appreciated, not maybe not the right word, but it's the underutilized condition. Like most people think that they get a 10% rating for their elbow and it's done, but there are a lot of different ratings that can be attributed to the elbow that are not considered pyramiding. So it can get quite a few separate actual 10% here, 10% there type thing. So the format of this video is going to be, we're going to go dive into the manual first and kind of see what the manual says about what the, how separate ratings can be assigned. Then we're going to look a little bit at what the range of motions look like. So that way I can describe to you the range of motions from the manual or from the 38 CFR Part 4 itself. We're going to go into how it's rated. Okay, so what the actual rating scheduler criteria are, what the diagnostic codes are, things like that. Then we're going to go into and we're going to talk about the actual DBQ itself. Now, for two reasons. Number one, so that way you can kind of see how the process works. And number two, if you do the private DBQ option, so you can kind of see where the main focal points are for the elbow. And then we're going to round it off with what should happen in the unlikely event, and hopefully you don't have to have this happen, that you get a full total prosthetic elbow replacement, which is rare, but it can happen. So we'll go over how that's rated also. So buckle in. It's going to be just dry stuff on this one, guys. So let me go ahead and share my screen. Now, I'm going to apologize up front because I have tried to record this video a couple times now, and my Great Dane has climbed somehow underneath the bed over here and has a squeaky toy. So you might hear a squeak every once in a while. If you do, I apologize. It's not me doing it. It is Luna doing it, and she's being a bad dog. So let's start off with 531B, 1C. And all of these manual references and 38 CFRs for the most part will be included in the video description. So this right here talks about separate ratings, separate evaluations being granted for disabilities of the elbow, forearm, and wrist. Now, the forearm is shared between the wrist and the elbow. So the upper part of the forearm, for the most part, is shared with the elbow. The lower part can be shared with the wrist. But the main, and there are others, so I'm going to caveat this by saying that there are others, so this is not an absolute. The main granted conditions for the elbow are limitation of flexion, limitation of extension, limitation of forearm supination and pronation under these different diagnostic codes. And there's actually more than this. So let me just scroll down here. Now, this provides an example of how a person can get different disabilities. And this is why I say that the elbow is drastically it's discounted by a lot of veterans. Oh, I just got 10%. So here's a fact pattern. This is an example to help raters kind of see the differences here. They had a vehicle rollover accident, and then they have the following impairments due to it. So they've got limitation of flexion to 90 degrees. They have elbow limitation of extension to 45 degrees. They have full range of motion on supination and pronation with painful supination. And I will explain what that looks like, what pronation and supination look like in the next one. And full range of motion in the wrist dorsiflexion. Now, we're not going to be discussing the wrist in this one, so we will only be talking about these three. So when we're talking about it, based upon range of motion, which is how the pain and range of motion are going to be what you're dealing with for the most part in how you get the rating that you get. So medications don't really matter. Whether or not you wear a sling, it doesn't matter. There's no it just has to do with the limited range of motion and painful motion. So you get 20% for elbow flexion because you're limited to 90 degrees. You would also get 10% for limited extension because you're limited to 45 degrees. Now, I will say this. You can only get pain, the minimum 10% rating for pain, one time per joint. So in the elbow joint, the 20% was determined by the range of motion. The 10% was determined by the range of motion. And this, because it's full range of motion, should be 0. But because you have painful supination, you get 10%. So you get a 20, a 10, and a 10 just from the elbow. Just from the elbow. So it is interesting. Yeah, separate evaluations can be done for limited range of motions for flexion and extension. And that's basically it. So this is a use case example of how you can get 20, 10, and 10. Amazing. I say amazing because it's a lot of percentages, but it is always sad whenever if you met this criteria, you would be suffering. So that kind of sucks. So this is from 38 CFR Part 4, and I just wanted to point out what forearm pronation is and what supination is. So for pronation, you start out in this position and you roll your hand into where you're, kind of fist bumping somebody. So you would actually be, starting out in this position and then rolling forward into this one. So that's what the act of pronation is. And that's as far as you should humanly be able to do it. It has a range of motion between 0 degrees and 80 degrees. 0 degrees looks like this. But supination is the exact opposite, where you start out in the fist bump position and then you turn into this position. So each of them, the rolling over this way has a longer degrees, but this is basically it. So that's what the range of motion for pronation and supination kind of look like. They should end up looking like this at the end of it. So, now this is just talking about the different diagnostic codes, some of the different diagnostic codes that you can have for the forearm and the elbow. Now, even though it's the elbow, we still rate it under like the forearm. We'll consider that portion of the elbow the forearm. So you have limited flexion back here. If you have limited flexion, 5206, but the rater calls it the forearm. So please don't get those confused if you see on there, hey, I claimed elbow, but you're saying that I got the forearm. They're a synonym for each other. So you've got limited flexion, you've got limited extension, you've got forearm flexion limited, which we'll get into that here in just a second. And then you have other ones of the supination and pronation impairment. Those two are combined together. I know, baby. It's okay. Sorry, my dog's whining at me. And then you have different disabilities here of the actual bones. So the radius, which is on the side of your thumb, it's your forearm bone, and the ulna, which is on the side of your pinky. These would have to be breaks, some kind of non-union like type break or something like that. Ulnar impairment, radius impairment. All of these additional conditions will be on the DBQ. So the same DBQ for all of the elbow and forearm is used. So if your examiner should, if you say, hey, look, I've got elbow pain, they'll do the normal limited range of motion stuff, but they will also look through your records to see if you have radius and ulna non-union, ulnar impairment, radius impairment, things like that. So obviously, if you have these things, point them out, specifically claim them, because unless the examiner's really, your limitation of motion is not going to be, not going to need an x-ray. There's a possibility for them to top sheet on that, but let's keep going here. So 5206, how is it rated? So we're honestly just dealing with limitation of flexion. So the full range, like if you have up to 110 degrees of movement, and what we mean by flexion is if your arms are straight out, that's 0 degrees. So you're not bending in any way, shape, or form. But if you try to bend towards your body like you're doing an arm curl, that's what they're talking about. How limited are you? So if you can get to 110 degrees, from your, I guess 0 degree resting position, normal position. But this is it. So this is the level of limitations, and these are the effective, percentages. Now, the major up here deals with which hand are you. If you say that you're right-handed, then your right arm is your major arm. Your left arm in that scenario would be your minor arm. Now, ambidextrous, you get, it's whatever's most advantageous at that point in time. But ambidextrous you don't get both majors primarily. But you won't see any change until you get into this particular level and above. And then the major starts taking over and it starts becoming 10% higher. The minor kind of gets worked over here between the 90 and 70 degrees. It stays the same, which is, they could have half pointed that maybe or something. I don't know. But anyway, this is the full extent of how the forearm limitation of flexion is determined. There's no mysteries here. So if you have, like, let's say flare-ups, and your flare-ups limit you to 55 degrees, there's not going to be any kind of criteria here for x-rays or MRIs or anything like that. It's just strictly how you present at your examination and what you talk about in terms of your flare-ups and what your medical records kind of deem you to have. Now, if you have an elbow sprain and you can't move to 45 degrees, that's going to require, most of the time, whenever you have extreme limitations of range of motion, there has to be a cause. So sometimes the examiners can, walk that back and go, you know what, I think that there might be something else going on. But the actual forearm, elbow strain itself only limits to 70 degrees. The rest of this range of motion reduction is due to some other condition, Now we get into the forearm limitation of extension. This has to do with once you do an arm curl, it's when you return your arm back to pointing straight out. That's what limitation of extension is. And limitation of extension, it starts out to where your elbow would have to be permanently bent to some degree. But you start out similar to the flexion in that 10%, 10%, 10%, 10%, 20%, 20%. And then when you have to get extreme in order for, once for the bilateral divergence here to kick in. But once again, the minor arm gets kind of worked over between the 75 and 90 degrees. Once again, easy peasy. It's going to be how you present it your examiner as to what percentage you get. But you can still get multiple percentages. Now, right here, this is if you meet just this criteria. So if you meet extension to 45 degrees, which would be 10, and you meet limitation of flexion to 100 degrees, that's 10, then we would combine it into this. There's no, I guess there is no advantage to it. I don't understand it. It makes no sense. I don't know why it's here. I can't think of a use case of why this would be here. Because what would happen is, like, let's say you do get rated under this. Let's say that your extension pops up to 60 degrees. Well, actually, no. Let's say your extension pops up to 75 degrees to where it becomes 20% itself. Well, then we would break out your flexion and your extension into separate ratings again. So if they should combine them into one rating, it's not going to hurt you. It's not going to hurt anything, because if the facts, the evidence meet a higher separate evaluation, then the rater will separate these out. Or, well, actually, VBMSR will separate them out and put them into two separate things if the separate evaluations equal more than 20, or if you don't meet this criteria specifically. Now, the elbow, 5209, other impairments, flail joint. Okay. So flail joint's going to be that circumstance where you have no control over that elbow joint. You can't actually, um, you know, have any control over it. It's just wiggling around. So it's very, very severe. It has to do with joint fracture with marked cubitus, various. I mean, we're throwing out all the medical terms here. So this will have to be on the DBQ itself. But there's going to be deformity involved. There's going to be ununited fracture of the head of the radius. I mean, horrible things here for at least the 20%. The flail joint itself, it has to meet, there's certain criteria for flail joint that it has to meet, but if it does, these would be the percentages that you get. You cannot have a sprained elbow and walk into it and go, I have flail joint. Yeah, that ain't going to work out. You have to meet certain criteria. So, and the criteria is so specific, it's going to be on the doctor's side. Me educating you to flail joint is not worthwhile because the doctor will either say, ooh, yeah, you've got flail joint, or no, you don't. So moving on. These are the other impairments here. I'm just going to go through them real quick. 5210, radius and ulna non-union of with flail false joint. When you have this radius and ulna, it's going to probably be pyramiding up here. Just because it's the joint. So it'll probably fall under this 50, 50 and 40. 5211, I've never rated this, by the way. That's why I don't know. 5211, ulnar impairment of non-union of the upper half with false movement. This is, once again, this is going to be heavy medical. This is going to be the doctor making that determination. There's going to have to be testing done to show loss of bone substance, marked deformity, x-rays, CT scans. Like, this is not something that the doctor's going to eyeball. This is going to be supported with a lot of medical evidence. Okay. So, and then this is how this is rated. Pretty similar. If the impairment of range of motion is due to this ulnar impairment, then it's going to probably be pyramiding to where, and I've never rated this either. It's just kind of a rare thing. I'm just bringing it up. 5212, radius impairment of non-union. So this is what happens for the ulna if it's true. This is what happens for the radius if it's true. Same set of criteria as the ulna. And then we come down here to supination and pronation, which is the common ones. If you want to know what the most common ratings are, it's typically for painful motion of the flexion. That's typically the one that gets rated the most. I have seen extension beforehand, but supination and pronation are oftentimes also granted. You can have loss of bone fusion on this. If you have 10% for the pain, like the example said, the minimum for pronation impairment under this criteria is 20. The minimum is 20. But if you have painful motion of supination or pronation only, then you can get 10% separately for that. But this is like horribly specific situations where your hand is fixed. Your joint is fixed. You cannot, near the middle arc. This all determines on where your hand, in what position your hand is fixated in, to where you cannot roll your supination and pronation. You cannot effectively do these movements right here. It's locked in whatever position it's locked in. So in that scenario, these would be what you would get. Okay. And then you have, at least for bone fusion, and then you have normal limitation of pronation and normal limitation of supination. These are going to be what you see more often. The hand fix thing, I've never seen that. That's something I've never rated before, and I've never seen in a rating decision before. So maybe I'm just a sheltered person. I don't know. But we're talking about the supination to 30 degrees or less, 10. If you have painful supination, it would also equal 10. Limitation of pronation, motion lost beyond the middle arc. That's going to just have to do with how far you can if you can go halfway or not. And that's a pretty significant amount. Motion loss beyond the last quarter of the arc, like you can't do the full turning over type thing, the full pronation to where you fully turn your hand back over into making the fist bump type, um, have it in that particular position. Now, I do want to take a second here, and I'm going to just mark this as very important. If you should have, and I haven't said this beforehand, and we're getting ready to woof, and hold on. All right, I'm hoping that the woofing is done now. But so one of the things that hasn't been asked of me, but I know that somebody will have the question is, what if I have like a condition like Ehlers-Danlos, or I have like like my tendons, I have, was it double jointed is what the lay people call it, but it's actually like your tendons are looser than normal and you can exceed the normal range of motion. What happens in that event if I can go further than 80 degrees or further than 85 degrees? Do I get compensated for that? And I know I'm kind of setting myself up for like a hardship on this one because technically, no, because you have to fall within these categories and you need to stop the woofing over there. But you need to fall within these categories in order to have it count. If you should have excessive range of motion, the most you'll probably get is pain, because if you're exceeding the normal range of motion, then your joints are outside of their normal capacity, which can cause you to experience pain, or they can cause you to experience sprains easier because your muscles, when your joints are outside of the normal designated range, your muscles are having to also compensate for that. So you can kind of strain your muscles, you can do stuff like that. So I know that nobody's asked that of me, but like anytime that you have hyper flexibility, it doesn't necessarily count like it should. Let me go ahead and undo that. So yeah, so you have limitation of pronation beyond the middle arc. This is going to be determined by VBMSR. I'm not going to look up and see what the middle arc is or anything like that. I'm just going to plug your numbers. This is where the rater becomes a data entry specialist, and they're just going to take the numbers on your DBQ, transcribe them onto VBMSR, and then the computer will spit out which one of these particular limitations count for you. Like, are you going to get limitation of flexion? Are you going to get limitation of extension separately rated? That's going to be up to the computer to calculate that. Now, why does it matter for you to know these things? Well, it matters because if you have flare-ups and you have whatnot, if you have flare-ups, and let's say that your normal range of motion, if we go back here to this example where it's like, hey, look, I have full range of motion on my supination, but whenever I have a flare-up, I'm reduced down to, middle arc pronation. Well, that matters. That's a big deal. That's a 30% big deal if that's true for you, right? Don't get it in your head that just, hey, I can, I have pain whenever I bend it towards me. Cool, that's 10%. But you could be shortchanging yourself by not accurately telling all the symptoms because you think all the examiner wants to hear about is it painful whenever I bend it towards myself? Because a lot of people, and I mean this, a lot of people discount the elbow and how high you can get rated for what seems like just normal limitations of motion that you would not get compensated for, but you can. So let's go over the DBQ real quick. And I hope I'm explaining this well. I've had to cut the video so many times because of the woofers. And whenever I play this back, I'm going to be disappointed in myself. So, as always, whenever I'm reviewing DBQs and how I've reviewed them in the past, I'm going to be talking about the VA experience when you go to a VA examiner, and I'm also going to be throwing in some private DBQ stuff. So it needs to be filled out correctly. If you're going through a private provider, they need to say what records and specifically identify what records they reviewed, what the date ranges were for them, you know, things like that. It helps with the authenticity of the DBQ. If you are reviewing a VA DBQ or a private DBQ, it is always important to make sure that your right-handed, what handed you are, is accurately reflected, because you can have circumstances where they put down the wrong handedness and you got shortchanged by 10%. This is also true, and I'm going to do another very important here. It is also true that you should probably go, if you've had any kind of upper extremity rating decision, it is important to go to a VSO and look to see on the code sheet whether or not the handedness they gave you is accurate, because you could have been shortchanged with a clear and unmistakable error that the rater, see this checkbox right here? This is the same thing, a similar thing that the rater has to do in VBMSR, where they have to determine what handedness you are. If the rater's not paying attention, or the rater actually top sheeted this and they looked at the prior rating decision and saw that you were right-handed, but in truth you're left-handed, and all your stuff is related to your left hand, but they shortchanged you, this is something you might want to check out, because you could have a clear and unmistakable error. And this is the more you know segment of the DBQ. So let me click off that real quick. Just a little aside there is that you should always check the handedness is accurate and everything. And sorry, my dog is breathing under the door. Diagnosis sometimes matters. We're going to say here for like ankylosis, you know, ankylosis matters for those higher level, you know, if we're dealing with any kind of I think it's the top one, ankylosis itself, you have to have a diagnosis of ankylosis. There's a lot of big ticket items here, but your range of motion would be limited. I mean, there's going to be clear identifiers for that, but when you're dealing with the rest of these, the diagnosis itself doesn't matter, except whenever you get down here to flail joint, or you get down here to like a false flail false joint. Those need to be diagnosed also. So if you're looking for any of these niche kind of diagnostic, I would say niche DC codes in which you think you should be rated under, then that particular, like a radius impairment, it should be like a non-union fracture of the radius. That should be reflected here on this diagnostic section or diagnosis section, even if it's down here in the other specified. So if you don't have, like, let's say you are claiming false flail joint, like let's say, or ankylosis. Let's say you're claiming ankylosis and you don't get a diagnosis of ankylosis. That will hurt you. So you need to look at the, you need to look at the DBQ and make sure that the diagnosis accurately reflects your treatment history and whatnot. All right, so that's the diagnosis section. So we get down here to medical history. This is going to be the section that the rater's looking at, that they're going to start picking apart all the casual things that the examiner, either VA or non-VA examiner, wrote about you to see if it matches all the check boxes that the examiner checked. Because if it doesn't, that's a sign of inauthenticity, either on the VA, it's an insufficiency for the VA examiner, but it's inauthenticity for the private provider. So does the veteran report flare-ups? Well, if you have flare-ups, this box needs to be checked. If you talked about flare-ups and the examiner said no, and they also didn't do the range of motion for flare-ups, then that could be a duty to assist error. Moving on. So functional loss is something I'm going to do a video about, because them checking functional loss here does not count as functional loss for VA purposes. Okay, so just because they check the box doesn't mean you're going to get functional loss of any joint that you claim. And then we talk about painful motion. Are there any complaints of painful motion on flexion or extension? And it's like, sure. All that's going to do is give you, like, marking this yes just gives you the minimum 10% on the joint on a plane of motion. Are there complaints of painful motion on supination or pronation? Sure, but you can only get it one time. So when we get down here to the range of motion, this is going to be basically how your claim is decided. So you can have it to where and they do them side by side, which is nice. As a rater, I like it when they're side by side because it's easier for me to just go bam, 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 bam whenever I'm entering in the information. And I don't have to go right elbow and then go scroll down to left elbow. I can just do it all at once. It's all very nice. So typically what you'll see is like all range of motion is normal. If they do all normal, like this is your baseline range of motion right here. You can have your baseline range of motion be normal, but your flare-ups be drastically different. And that's fine. The way that the rating for all musculoskeletal joints works with all musculoskeletal joints works is that we'll enter in whatever the examiner puts in. We'll just enter that into VBMS. We enter them all in, and then VBMS takes the worst one and uses that. So just because you have all normal up here does not mean that you were shortchanged in any way, shape, or form. So that's the first range of motion test. And then we talk about unclaimed joint, damaged joints. So this is where the actual range of motion gets put in. Maybe. Won't let me. But you would have flexion. So active range of motion performed. Sure. You would just put in these, and then they would have a section for tell us what part is painful. Now, they don't have to check this. They can talk about painful motion up here in the description and section, but it's more complete when they do this because it just helps us to not have to read. We can just go, boom, okay, painful motion here, here, and here. Because in VBMSR, there's a section for check the box for whatever painful motion was, and if they check the boxes, we'll just add them in. So this is where the range of motion goes. Passive range of motion we don't really use. A lot of is there evidence of pain? If there's just one evidence of pain, we check the box and you get the minimum 10% for that particular plane of motion. So I don't understand why there's 70 different instances of painful motion on here. It doesn't matter. So then you'll have observed repetitive use range of motion. And then what'll happen is they'll just go ahead and they'll put in the numbers. They'll mark, okay, if there is reduction on the range of motion, why is it? This doesn't matter. None of this matters at all. Like this right here doesn't matter. If they didn't accurately put this in here, the only one that you care about is pain. There is no additional benefit. There's no additional higher evaluation for any of these being checked. Doesn't matter for rating purposes. Then we come here to repeated use over time. This is another big one. So then we talk about the same thing. Why is there issues? Why is there functional loss? We don't care. We care if there's pain. That's all we care about. The rater will just plug and play whatever the examiner put in here. Now, the rater is going to look to see if there's any kind of discrepancies. Like if they put 95 in here and the range is to 85, they're going to have to explain why they put 95 right here because it falls outside of the normal range of motion. Because this would be an example of if you had double jointedness and you could extend further than the joint's normal range of motion. There's no value added to putting this. It doesn't get you a higher percentage because when the VA is looking at range of motion, they're looking exclusively at these values right here for the specific plane of motion: flexion, extension, supination, pronation. All right, this is going to be a long one, guys. Flare-ups. Now, this is important. If you do have flare-ups, this is going to be the most severe thing. This is where you get to estimate the range of motion in the degrees for the joint's flare-ups based upon the information procured from relevant sources, including lay statements of the veteran. This is one of the few times where the VA gets to take you at your word and 100% of the time. Now, can the examiner disagree that your condition should not cause flare-ups? Yeah, they can do that. And they would write up a medical rationale as to why they don't believe that. And that can cause issues. It has in the past. I've had to defer things back and go, wait a minute. Veteran says he has flare-ups. Can you medically justify why you're not accounting for the veteran's flare-ups? You know, so it does happen, and sometimes the examiner will win, but the evidence of that conclusion, that addendum they do, that, you know, we'd have to actually, review that for the probative value. Now, additional factors, not important. Muscle atrophy, not really important. This can be important for neurological conditions, but no. And then we come down here to ankylosis. Ankylosis is important for that top tier ankylosis type issue. You're going to find this. This is where this portion of the DBQ is where we start getting into the ankylosis and other impairments. These are unique. They have to be, factually true based upon evidence. This has to be backed up with some kind of x-ray, something. Like, you can't just walk in there and just go, last week I had elbow sprain. Now I've got full ankylosis of the elbow. Okay, could you please give me the make and model of the car that hit you yesterday? Because that is not a progression that happens naturally. I'm just going to say it. I would cry foul on that every day of the week. Like, obviously, did they fall down the stairs and break their arm? Like, what happened? Help me to understand. Because if not, you need to medically rationalize how that person could get from that healthy to that unhealthy. And it was drastic. I'm not just saying like a little bit. I'm saying that they had zeros for all of their range of motion, where beforehand they had like 10 degrees impairment maybe, but now they've got all zeros. They can't move. They're basically a straw, a straight straw. That's them. They can't move their back. They can't do anything. So yeah, this has to be factually true and coupled with evidence. So does the veteran have flail joint? So this is where we're going to have, yes, and they're going to, depending on the check boxes, that's where we get some of these down here. So in order to get what you get, the examiner has to check the boxes. I'm not going to find this in your Capri records. Okay, this is not on me to find it. This is up to the examiner to mark it. Okay, I can potentially find flail joint in your records, but I can't find joint fracture, cubitus, various deformity. Like, I'm not going to find that. So you, as the veteran, have to be a little bit more diligent in establishing and identifying this evidence, pointing it out, highlighting it. The rater's not going to know this, right? The only way, like, this is where the rater becomes a data entry specialist, and they trust the examiner implicitly because they don't know. There's no way for us to know this stuff. False joint, I have no clue. I mean, I personally have a clue. I'd be able to kind of notice this, but I wouldn't be able to justify noticing it and acting on it with QRT. QRT would not take my word for it. I would have to demonstrate it, show where that's true, right? That's the way QRT works. So anyway, so this is the rest of the area. If you have these things, then you need to make sure that this is filled out accurately. Sorry, huge edit cut there. My dog freaked out, pulled out the microphone, knocked over my desk. It was a hot mess. So I have been spending a few minutes putting things back together. So I've kind of lost where I am on this, but let me just say that this portion of the DBQ requires a lot of, the examiner is going to need to fill this in. The rater is going to just be a data entry specialist. So we've got surgical procedures, other physical findings. Scars are important too. Like, if you had any surgeries, that will need to be represented. And then the assistive devices doesn't matter. Like, it doesn't affect your rating any. And then diagnostic tests, yes. Post-traumatic arthritis doesn't really matter for this particular joint series. I'm trying to wrap this up. Functional impact, once again, functional impact does not work the way that people think it works. If they mark yes here, that's not that you have functional impact. It begins the conversation of that you have functional impact. And then finally, the remarks section is going to be where we're going to also scrutinize what the examiner says and whether or not they say something in the remarks section that contradicts something they said earlier. So make sure that all the remarks are dress right dress. And then finally, this is the area where inauthenticity can happen. I put out a video today on it where the information here, like the area of practice, the name, title, the NPI number, the examiner's address, if that doesn't match the NPI index, technically the VSR and rater can consider the DBQ inauthentic if it's a private DBQ. So that's about all I got for that. Now, the final thing, and I know I'm just doing this, is if you have a total elbow replacement, this is the 38 CFR 5052 would be the diagnostic code for it. You get 1 year following, well, 1 year and 1 month. So 13 months at 100% for a total prosthetic joint replacement. And then you have a minimum evaluation of 30 for the major, 20 for the minor. And then if you have residuals that constitute severe painful motion or weakness, you could get this, or if it's more advantageous, the rater could separately grant each of the separate conditions if it was more advantageous than this. But anyway, guys, that's about all I've got for you today. It's been a long video, and I'm sorry for that. And it's hopefully going to get cut down a lot because I have dog squeaky toys and nonsense going on. It's pandemonium over here at Rater HQ today. But anyway, thank you to all those that watched until the end. If you had the patience, I appreciate it. If you haven't already liked and subscribed, please do so. I know the elbow is not, the sizzle, but it can be for individuals if their fact pattern of evidence matches it. This can definitely be something that at times can be more way more than, say, like the back and radiculopathy combined. Anyway, that's about all I got for you today. Rater out.